I am Hercule Poirot. Welcome to my new mystery story.
The December wind rattled the tall windows of Greystone Hall with the persistence of an unwelcome creditor, while inside, the warmth of the grand dining room seemed to pulse with an altogether different kind of tension. Lady Beatrice Thornfield stood beside the mahogany sideboard, her fingers absently adjusting the placement of silver serving spoons that required no adjustment, her pale blue eyes surveying the dinner party she had so carefully orchestrated. The table was set for 9, a number she had calculated with the precision of a chess master positioning pieces for checkmate. Each place setting gleamed under the crystal chandelier, the family's finest spode china arranged with mathematical exactitude, wine glasses positioned to catch the light like small expectant mirrors. The menu cards, written in her own careful script, promised an evening of culinary excellence. Consommé Célestine, sole Véronique, côtelette d'agneau aux haricots verts, pêche cardinale. Yet Lady Beatrice knew that food would be the least important element of this particular gathering. At 62, she possessed the kind of understated elegance that comes not from wealth alone, but from generations of breeding and the confidence that accompanies absolute social position. Her silver hair was arranged in perfect waves, her black silk dress chosen to complement the Thornfield diamonds that had adorned her throat for 30 years of marriage. Tonight, however, those diamonds felt heavier than usual, as if they carried the weight of secrets she could no longer bear alone. The guests began arriving at precisely 7:30, each entrance carefully choreographed by Jameson, the butler whose 40 years of service had taught him to read the undercurrents of upper-class society with the skill of a practiced diplomat. First came Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the family physician whose knowledge of the late Lord Thornfield's final months made him both indispensable and dangerous. He was a compact man with shrewd eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, carrying himself with the quiet authority of one who held life and death in his capable hands. Next arrived Mrs. Vivian Ashford, her late husband's business partner in the antiquities trade. She swept in wearing emerald green velvet, her auburn hair defying the December wind, her smile as carefully cultivated as her reputation for ruthless negotiation. The two women exchanged the sort of cordial greeting that concealed a multitude of unresolved tensions. Gerald Thornfield, Lady Beatrice's stepson, entered with his wife Penelope clinging to his arm like a beautiful barnacle. Gerald possessed his father's weak chin and none of his business acumen, a combination that had led to gambling debts of staggering proportions. Penelope, 20 years his junior, had married him for his prospects that were rapidly diminishing with each turn of the cards at his club. Professor James Hartwell arrived alone, as always, his scholarly demeanor barely concealing the passionate nature that had once led to scandal in Cairo. His expertise in Egyptian artifacts had made him invaluable to the Thornfield collection, but recent discoveries had raised uncomfortable questions about the provenance of certain pieces. Miss Sarah Pemberton, Lady Beatrice's personal secretary, appeared next, a woman of 35 whose plain exterior concealed a mind as sharp as any barrister's. She had been with the family for 8 years, privy to correspondence and documents that could destroy reputations with surgical precision. Finally, Mr. Charles Blackwood, the family solicitor, made his entrance with the measured dignity of a man who had spent decades managing other people's secrets. His presence tonight was both professional and personal, for he alone knew the true extent of Lord Thornfield's final arrangements. The last guest to arrive was Sir Reginald Fortescue, the antiquities expert whose authentication could make or break a collection's value. He was a man of considerable girth and even greater appetite, known throughout London for his ability to consume vast quantities of food while delivering devastating critiques of questionable artifacts. As they gathered in the drawing-room for aperitifs, Lady Beatrice observed the careful dance of social interaction, noting how certain guests avoided others, how conversations died when particular names were mentioned, how glances were exchanged like coded messages across the room. "My dear friends," she announced as Jameson appeared to signal that dinner was served, "I trust this evening will prove illuminating for us all." They processed into the dining room with the solemnity of mourners at a funeral, an observation that would prove more prophetic than anyone could have imagined. Sir Reginald was seated at Lady Beatrice's right hand, a position of honor that he accepted with obvious pleasure. He examined the menu card with the attention of a scholar reviewing ancient texts, his eyes lighting up at the promised delicacies. "Magnificent, my dear Beatrice," he declared, unfolding his napkin with ceremonial care. "Though I must confess, my physician has been lecturing me about moderation. Apparently, my constitution is not as robust as my appetite." Dr. Whitfield, seated across from him, raised an eyebrow. "Sound advice, Reginald. The heart is not designed to support excessive indulgence indefinitely." "Bah!" Sir Reginald waved a dismissive hand. "Life is too short for abstinence. Besides, I have my little helpers." He patted his waistcoat pocket with a knowing smile. The first course was served with Jameson's customary efficiency. The consommé arrived in delicate porcelain bowls, its golden surface reflecting the candlelight like liquid amber. Sir Reginald lifted his spoon with anticipation, then paused, his face suddenly clouding. "I say," he murmured, pressing a hand to his chest, feeling rather, peculiar. Lady Beatrice leaned toward him with concern. "Reginald, are you quite well?" Sir Reginald's face had begun to take on an alarming pallor, beads of perspiration appearing on his broad forehead despite the room's comfortable temperature. His hand trembled as he reached into his waistcoat pocket, withdrawing a small silver pillbox. Just need a moment," he gasped, fumbling with the tiny clasp. The box slipped from his fingers, clattering to the floor and spilling its contents, small white tablets that scattered across the Persian carpet like fallen stars. Dr. Whitfield was on his feet instantly, moving around the table with professional urgency. But before he could reach Sir Reginald's side, the antiquities expert lurched forward with a strangled cry, his face contorting in sudden, terrible pain. "My God," whispered Professor Hartwell, his scholarly composure shattered. Sir Reginald's body convulsed once, violently, then went rigid. His eyes, wide with shock and terror, stared sightlessly at the untouched bowl of consommé before him. A faint, bitter scent, like almonds left too long in the sun, seemed to emanate from his still form. Dr. Whitfield reached him within seconds, his fingers searching for a pulse that was no longer there. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft sobbing of Penelope Thornfield and the gentle tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. "He's dead," Dr. Whitfield announced quietly, his professional manner barely concealing his shock. "Sir Reginald Fortescue is dead." The most chilling detail of all was immediately apparent to everyone present. The man who had died so dramatically at Lady Beatrice's carefully planned dinner party had not consumed so much as a spoonful of the meal set before him. The dinner guest had never eaten. As the local constabulary was summoned and the guests were asked to remain, Lady Beatrice found herself thinking of a small, precise Belgian gentleman whose reputation for solving the impossible had reached even her rarefied circles. She turned to Jameson with quiet determination. "Send a telegram to London," she instructed, "to Monsieur Hercule Poirot. Tell him that Lady Beatrice Thornfield requests his immediate assistance in a matter of the utmost gravity. Tell him that death has visited Greystone Hall, and only his little grey cells can uncover the truth." The stage was set, the players assembled, and the deadly game had begun. In the elegant dining room where Christmas dinner was meant to celebrate life and fellowship, death had claimed its victim with surgical precision, leaving behind only questions that would require the greatest detective mind of the age to answer. The telegram reached Hercule Poirot at his comfortable flat in Whitehaven Mansions at precisely 10:15 that evening, delivered by a messenger who had been instructed that time was of the utmost essence. Poirot, who had been arranging his collection of criminological texts in perfect alphabetical order, paused in his meticulous work to examine the urgent communication. His grey eyes, sharp as winter frost, scanned Lady Beatrice Thornfield's carefully worded plea twice before setting it upon his pristinely organized desk. Within the hour, he had packed his small leather valise with characteristic precision and arranged for the earliest possible departure to Greystone Hall. The December morning was crisp and bright as Poirot's hired motorcar wound through the frost-covered countryside toward the imposing Georgian estate. He spent the journey in contemplation, his gloved hands folded neatly in his lap, his magnificent moustaches perfectly waxed despite the early hour. Experience had taught him that first impressions of a crime scene were invaluable before well-meaning authorities could disturb the delicate balance of evidence that often held the key to truth. Greystone Hall emerged from the morning mist like a sleeping giant, its elegant facade speaking of generations of wealth and breeding. Jameson met Poirot at the front door with the sort of dignified relief that only a truly professional butler could display, though the detective's trained eye detected the slight tremor in the man's hands as he took his coat and hat. "Monsieur Poirot," Jameson intoned with formal precision, "Lady Beatrice is expecting you. The local constabulary has completed their initial examination, though I believe they are somewhat perplexed by the circumstances." Inspector Davies, a burly man whose experience rarely stretched beyond rural misdemeanors, greeted Poirot in the dining room with obvious relief. "Monsieur Poirot, thank goodness you've come. We've got a clear case of poisoning here. Cyanide, most likely. Judging by that almond smell, poor Sir Reginald's heart pills, we think they were tampered with." He gestured toward the carpet where the scattered tablets had been carefully collected. Poirot nodded politely but did not immediately examine the evidence. Instead, he stood at the threshold, his keen gaze sweeping across the grand dining room with methodical precision. The long mahogany table remained set as it had been the previous evening, each place setting a monument to interrupted elegance. Most significantly, Sir Reginald's bowl of consommé sat untouched, its golden surface now filmed with a thin, cold skin. "The deceased, he consumed nothing?" Poirot inquired softly, his accent lending gravity to the simple question. "Not a morsel," Davies confirmed. "Odd that. He was quite the gourmand, Sir Reginald, but he died before he could even lift his spoon." Poirot circled the table slowly, his patent leather shoes silent on the Persian carpet. He observed the precise arrangement of crystal and silver, the mathematical placement of each chair, the subtle signs of a dinner party, abruptly halted. At Sir Reginald's place, he paused, noting the untouched napkin, the pristine cutlery, the water glass with its faint crescent of moisture that had captured a fine dust not present on the others. "The aperitifs," Poirot said suddenly, turning to Jameson. "They were served how?" "In the drawing-room, sir. Champagne cocktails on a silver tray. Each guest took one. Some had two. I collected the glasses before announcing dinner." "Ah." Poirot's eyes brightened with interest. "And these glasses, they have been disturbed?" "No, sir. They remain in the pantry, unwashed." In the butler's pantry, 9 slender glasses stood on a cloth-lined tray, their sugar rims dulled by time. 2 bore the faint imprint of lipstick, one bright scarlet, the other a softer rose. Poirot bent over each glass in turn, his nostrils flaring delicately. At one particular glass, he paused, not because of any obvious almond scent, but at the memory of something subtle, something that echoed the faint discord he had detected in the dining room's atmosphere. "Most interesting," he murmured, straightening with satisfaction. "Inspector, I believe we must speak with each guest individually. But first, tell me, was there any alteration to the seating arrangement last evening?" Davies consulted his notebook awkwardly. "Lady Beatrice mentioned that Professor Hartwell requested to sit nearer Sir Reginald. something about discussing artifacts during the meal. She had the place cards switched. Ah, but of course. Poirot smiled, that small apologetic smile that forgave his own moment of vanity. It is always the small changes, the tiny deviations from plan, that reveal the most profound truths. We shall begin our interviews presently, but first I must examine more closely this scene of interrupted hospitality. He returned to the dining room, his little grey cells already beginning to construct the framework upon which he would hang the facts of this most intriguing case. Poirot believed that the human heart, unlike the mechanical precision of a timepiece, revealed its secrets not through dismantling but through patient observation of its rhythms and irregularities. He requested that the morning room be prepared for his interviews, understanding that a comfortable yet formal setting would encourage the delicate balance between candor and caution that often yielded the most revealing truths. Inspector Davies, though more accustomed to direct interrogation methods, deferred to the Belgian's renowned expertise in matters of psychological deduction. Lady Beatrice Thornfield entered first, moving with the measured grace of a woman accustomed to command, even in the face of tragedy. She settled into the Queen Anne chair opposite Poirot with rigid composure, her hands folded precisely in her lap, though the detective's trained eye caught the slight tremor in her fingers as she adjusted her wedding ring. The pale winter sunlight filtering through the tall windows cast geometric patterns across her composed features, highlighting the careful control that masked deeper currents of emotion. "Madame," Poirot began gently, "you will forgive the necessity of these questions, but I must understand the purpose of last evening's gathering. Was there a particular reason for assembling these specific guests?" A shadow crossed Lady Beatrice's features, so briefly that a less observant man might have missed it entirely. "We had not entertained since my husband's passing in September, Monsieur Poirot. I felt it was time to resume our social obligations. Sir Reginald had agreed to provide his formal authentication of an Egyptian sarcophagus that my late husband acquired shortly before his death. There had been whispers about its provenance, and I wished them quashed. And the other guests. Mr. Blackwood had insisted that I announce certain financial arrangements regarding Gerald's inheritance. He felt it should be done in the presence of witnesses." Her voice carried the weight of family obligations reluctantly shouldered. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "The seating arrangement was altered at Professor Hartwell's request. Yes, he claimed Sir Reginald had misunderstood some detail about the cartouche inscriptions. I saw no harm in accommodating him." She paused, then added with careful precision, "Jameson also replaced Sir Reginald's water glass just before we sat down. Reginald detested lemon, and the footman had garnished all the waters. He sent his back." This detail caused Poirot's eyes to brighten with interest. "The replacement was handled by Jameson alone." "Yes, he brought a fresh glass from the pantry himself. No one else touched it." When Lady Beatrice departed, leaving behind the faint scent of lavender and an aura of carefully controlled grief, Poirot reflected on the steel resolve that belied her seemingly fragile appearance. The woman who had orchestrated last evening's gathering was no mere society hostess, but a chess player positioning pieces for purposes not yet fully revealed. Dr. Whitfield arrived next, his medical bag clutched firmly in his hand, speaking with the professional detachment of a man who had spent decades observing the frailties of human flesh. "Sir Reginald suffered from angina, Monsieur Poirot. I had prescribed nitroglycerin tablets for sublingual use along with daily digitalis. The pills that scattered from his box were indeed nitroglycerin, prescribed within the past month. You observed him closely during his final moments. Indeed, the symptoms were unmistakably those of cyanide poisoning. The bitter almond scent, the sudden collapse, the facial discoloration. Most significantly, I noticed a trace of moisture on his lips as if he had recently wetted them, though I initially assumed it was perspiration." Poirot leaned forward with interest. "You are certain he consumed nothing from his dinner setting?" "Absolutely nothing. He never lifted his spoon. The poisoning occurred before he reached the table, most likely during the aperitif hour. Dr. Whitfield's keen eyes, accustomed to reading more than mere symptoms, seemed to weigh each word carefully. Gerald Thornfield and his wife Penelope entered together, Gerald's weak features bearing the telltale signs of chronic worry that spoke of gambling debts and poor decisions. Penelope, despite her obvious distress, retained the calculated beauty of a woman who had married for prospects rather than affection. They settled onto the burgundy leather sofa with the careful distance of a couple united more by circumstance than genuine intimacy. "Dreadful business," Gerald began before Poirot had fully seated himself. Poor old Reginald, though we all knew his habits would catch up with him eventually. The man lived as if there were no tomorrow. "You had a clear view of Sir Reginald during dinner?" "Oh yes, we were seated directly across from Professor Hartwell next to each other. When Reginald began fumbling with that silver pill box of his, we could see everything clearly. Terrifying sight, really. One moment he was reaching for his pills, the next he was gone." Penelope dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, though Poirot noted the tears seemed more from shock than genuine grief. The sound he made, Monsieur Poirot, that awful gasping, and his face, the way it changed color, I shall never forget it. "During the aperitifs, did you observe anything unusual about Sir Reginald's behavior?" The couple exchanged glances before Gerald answered. "He seemed in excellent spirits, perhaps more animated than usual. He made some joke about needing his pills to survive the evening's indulgences. We all laughed, but now it seems rather prophetic." Mrs. Vivian Ashford swept in wearing the same emerald velvet from the previous evening, her auburn hair perfectly arranged despite the morning's tragic circumstances. She exuded a predatory elegance that spoke of years spent in competitive business dealings, her answers delivered with the precision of a woman accustomed to verbal sparring. "Sir Reginald and I had extensive business relationships, Monsieur Poirot," she stated without preamble. "He was a formidable competitor, and sometimes, yes, a difficult associate, but always fair in his own way." "There were recent disagreements?" "Over a rare Roman mosaic, among other pieces. We both coveted it, and our rivalry was more intellectual than personal." Her tone suggested otherwise, and Poirot detected a flicker of something sharper in her eyes when she described Sir Reginald's methods of acquisition. "You knew nothing of his medical condition?" "Our relationship was strictly professional. I had no interest in his personal affairs." As she departed, leaving behind the lingering scent of an exotic perfume that spoke of distant lands and perhaps distant secrets, Poirot noted how her carefully chosen words revealed as much by omission as by statement. As the morning room settled into silence once more, Poirot sat quietly, his fingertips pressed together in contemplation. 4 interviews. 4 distinct personalities, each offering carefully polished narratives that contained both truth and concealment. The doctor's professional judgment, Lady Beatrice's steely control, Gerald's financial desperation, Mrs. Ashford's competitive ambition, these were not merely reactions to sudden death, but facets of deeper, more intricate characters whose true natures were beginning to emerge like figures in a developing photograph. The little grey cells were already at work, sifting through the superficial pleasantries to uncover the profound currents of motive and opportunity that flowed beneath the surface of upper-class respectability. Each interview had revealed new threads in the tapestry of deception, and Poirot understood that the real game had only just begun. Professor James Hartwell entered the morning room with the measured stride of a scholar accustomed to navigating both ancient tombs and academic politics. His weathered hands, stained with decades of handling artifacts, trembled slightly as he settled into the chair, and Poirot observed how his eyes darted toward the window, as if seeking escape from uncomfortable truths. The professor's tweed jacket, though well-tailored, bore the subtle signs of genteel poverty that often accompanied academic life. "Professor," Poirot began with characteristic gentleness, You requested the change in seating arrangements. This was for what specific purpose? Hartwell's fingers worried at his frayed cuffs, a gesture that spoke of professional anxiety despite his scholarly reputation. Sir Reginald had questioned my translation of certain hieroglyphic inscriptions on the Thornfield sarcophagus. I wished to discuss the matter privately during dinner, to avoid any public embarrassment should he persist in his corrections. These corrections, they were significant to your professional standing. A flush crept up Hartwell's neck, staining his features with the crimson of remembered humiliation. There was an incident in Cairo some years ago. A papyrus I authenticated proved to be a modern creation. My reputation suffered considerably, though I maintained my innocence in the deception. His voice carried the bitter undertone of a man whose integrity had been publicly questioned. Sir Reginald made several pointed references to this unfortunate episode in our recent correspondence. When the professor departed, his shoulders bearing the weight of academic disgrace, Miss Sarah Pemberton entered with the quiet efficiency that had made her indispensable to Lady Beatrice's household management. Her plain brown dress and severely arranged hair spoke of a woman who had learned to render herself invisible while observing everything with remarkable precision. Miss Pemberton, Poirot began, as Lady Beatrice's secretary, you would have observed the guests closely during the aperitif hour. Did Sir Reginald display any particular habits or behaviors? Sarah's pale eyes flickered with the intelligence of a woman, trained in discretion. Sir Reginald had a rather childish habit, Monsieur Poirot. He would run his finger around the sugared rim of his cocktail glass and taste it before drinking, as if testing the sweetness. He did it last evening, making some jest about the sugar being the only sweetness he could trust in business dealings. This detail caused Poirot's grey eyes to brighten with sudden interest. You observed this clearly? Yes. He stood near the mantelpiece, quite visible to everyone. He laughed after tasting the rim, then drank his cocktail with apparent relish. It struck me as rather theatrical. But then Sir Reginald enjoyed being the centre of attention. Mr. Charles Blackwood followed, carrying his leather portfolio like a shield against uncomfortable revelations. The solicitor's manner was officially grave, but Poirot sensed the dry alertness of a man who had already drawn preliminary conclusions about the evening's events. Mr. Blackwood, the financial arrangements you planned to announce regarding Mr. Gerald Thornfield's inheritance, they would have been unwelcome news. The solicitor's mouth thinned with professional discretion warring against the need for clarity. Catastrophic would be more accurate, Monsieur Poirot. Gerald had assumed his inheritance would be immediately available upon his father's death. The reality was quite different. Lord Thornfield's will established a trust requiring Gerald to demonstrate financial responsibility for 2 years before receiving more than a modest allowance. And if he failed to meet these conditions, the inheritance would pass to Lady Beatrice's discretion, with the option of establishing a charitable foundation. Gerald would receive only a small annual stipend, insufficient to maintain his current lifestyle or satisfy his considerable gambling debts. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Sir Reginald was aware of these arrangements. Lord Thornfield had consulted him regarding the valuation of collection pieces that might need to be sold to satisfy Gerald's creditors. Sir Reginald had been quite vocal in his opinion that the young man's financial irresponsibility was a disgrace to the family name. Finally, Jameson appeared, summoned to provide his professional account of the evening's service. The butler stood with the composed humility of a man whose reliability had been tested by 40 years of managing upper-class secrets and social complexities. Jameson, Poirot said gently, during the cocktail service, you left the tray unattended briefly. Yes, sir. Lady Beatrice requested fresh curaçao. I stepped into the pantry for perhaps 2 minutes. The guests moved about freely during that time. And when you collected the glasses afterward, did you notice anything unusual? Jameson frowned, his professional memory sifting through the evening's details. Sir Reginald's glass felt sticky in one section, sir, along the rim where the sugar had been applied. I thought nothing of it. At the time, The fire makes the air rather humid." Poirot's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a man whose theory was finding confirmation in the smallest details. The sugar rim, the unattended tray, the sticky residue. The method was becoming clear, though the identity of the poisoner remained shrouded in the complex web of motives that surrounded Sir Reginald Fortescue's final evening. As the last interview concluded, Poirot remained in the morning room, his fingertips pressed together in that familiar gesture of concentrated thought. The winter afternoon light had begun to fade, casting long shadows across the Persian carpet, and he found himself reviewing each conversation with the methodical precision of a jeweler examining stones for flaws. The scattered pills, the untouched consommé, the replaced water glass, the sugared cocktail rim. Each detail formed part of a pattern that was beginning to emerge from the chaos of human emotion and deception. Inspector Davies returned with the eager expression of a man who believed he had found his answer, carrying a preliminary report from the police chemist. His weathered face bore the satisfaction of someone who preferred concrete evidence to psychological subtleties. "It's as I suspected, Monsieur Poirot," Davies declared, consulting his notes with obvious relief. "The chemist has examined Sir Reginald's nitroglycerin tablets. Several show traces of cyanide coating, a thin, almost invisible layer applied to the surface. The poor fellow must have ingested the poison when he placed the pill under his tongue. That's why he collapsed so suddenly during dinner." Poirot's grey eyes opened fully, regarding the inspector with the patient expression of a teacher faced with a well-meaning but hasty student. "Indeed, Inspector, a most ingenious theory. But consider, if you will, the timing of events. Sir Reginald complained of feeling peculiar, then fumbled for his medication. If the pills themselves were poisoned, would he not have shown symptoms immediately upon taking his previous dose? These tablets are prescribed for regular use, no?" Davies frowned, his confidence wavering slightly. Perhaps the coating was applied recently, just before the dinner party. Someone with medical knowledge, someone who knew his habits. "And the symptoms themselves," Poirot continued gently. "The immediate, violent convulsion, the bitter almond scent. Does this align precisely with a sublingual tablet that would dissolve slowly under the tongue?" "Cyanide acts swiftly, yes, but the delivery method must be considered." Despite his reservations, Poirot recognized the value of testing this theory against the assembled suspects. He requested that all guests be gathered once more in the drawing room, understanding that their reactions to this official explanation would reveal as much as their words. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot announced with Davies at his side, "the preliminary investigation has revealed that Sir Reginald's nitroglycerin tablets were tampered with, coated with a lethal dose of cyanide. This suggests that his killer possessed intimate knowledge of his medical condition and had access to his personal effects." The reaction was immediate and illuminating. Gerald Thornfield shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his weak features betraying anxiety that seemed disproportionate to mere shock. Penelope gasped dramatically, though Poirot noted how quickly she recovered her composure. Dr. Whitfield maintained professional calm while scrutinizing the announcement with clinical intensity, as if searching for medical inconsistencies. Mrs. Ashford's emerald eyes narrowed with calculation rather than surprise, suggesting a mind already working through implications and possibilities. Most interesting, however, was Professor Hartwell's visible relief, a reaction so pronounced that it bordered on the theatrical. "We are, of course, investigating all possibilities," Poirot continued, his gaze sweeping the assembled faces. "But I must ask, did anyone observe Sir Reginald handling his medication at any point before he complained of feeling unwell?" Several heads shook in denial, but Professor Hartwell, perhaps emboldened by the apparent shift in focus away from the cocktail hour, cleared his throat with scholarly authority. "I recall him fumbling with the pillbox as he began to feel ill, naturally. But before that, during the aperitifs, he was quite animated, quite jovial. He even made a point of showing us his cocktail, remarking on the exquisite sugar rim. He often indulged in such small pleasures, you understand. Poirot noted the almost imperceptible tensing of Lady Beatrice's jaw at this observation, a tiny flicker of something unreadable in her composed features. The professor, in his apparent attempt to support the pill theory, had inadvertently drawn attention back to the very element Poirot suspected held the key to the mystery. "Most illuminating, Professor," Poirot murmured, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. Yet his little grey cells were already working, recognizing that this first, seemingly obvious solution was precisely what the true killer had intended them to find. The game, he understood with growing certainty, was far more complex than Inspector Davies imagined, and the real murderer was still hidden among them, watching their investigation with careful satisfaction. As the guests dispersed, each carrying away their own interpretation of these revelations, Poirot remained behind, knowing that the most dangerous moment in any investigation was when one believed the case was solved. The truth, he sensed, lay not in the obvious answer, but in the subtle inconsistencies that only the most careful observation would reveal. That evening, as the winter darkness settled over Greystone Hall like a shroud, Poirot found himself increasingly troubled by the neat conclusion Inspector Davies had reached. The little grey cells, as he fondly termed his mental faculties, refused to accept the simplicity of poisoned medication when so many subtle inconsistencies remained unexplored. He requested that Jameson bring the tray of unwashed cocktail glasses to the drawing room, positioning it precisely as it had been offered during the previous evening's aperitifs. The butler, with the meticulous memory that 40 years of service had honed to perfection, arranged the glasses near the mantelpiece, angling the silver tray so that guests by the fire would naturally reach from the left. Poirot stood back, visualizing the movements of each guest as clearly as if they were still present in the room. Sir Reginald by the hearth, naturally drawn to warmth and prominence. Lady Beatrice near the windows where the lamplight would flatter her diamonds. Mrs. Ashford drifting between the piano and bookcase with predatory elegance. Dr. Whitfield positioning himself close to the fire for his rheumatism. Gerald fidgeting near the drinks as though proximity to abundance might cure his financial deficit. "Jameson," Poirot inquired with characteristic precision, "you observed Sir Reginald's particular ritual with his cocktail glass?" The butler's weathered features registered a flicker of understanding. "Indeed, sir. Sir Reginald always made quite a performance of it. He would trace his finger around the sugared rim, taste it with evident pleasure, and make some jest about it being the only sweetness he could trust in business dealings. Last evening was no different, though he seemed particularly theatrical about it." Poirot lifted Sir Reginald's glass with infinite care, holding it to catch the lamplight. Along one section of the rim, the sugar crystals appeared clumped and slightly dulled, as if affixed by something thicker than the citrus juice typically used in preparation. The rest of the circumference sparkled with the dry, even coating one would expect. As he brought the glass closer to his sensitive nostrils, the faintest echo of that bitter almond scent became apparent, so subtle that a less trained nose might dismiss it as imagination. "Most illuminating," he murmured, noting how a few stray granules beside the glass's resting place on the tray had fused together like coarse sand after rain. The killer had been extraordinarily clever, exploiting Sir Reginald's vanity and predictable habits to deliver poison through the most unexpected method imaginable. Poirot decided to test his growing theory through careful psychological probing, understanding that the guilty party would inevitably betray themselves through subtle reactions to seemingly innocent questions. He began with Professor Hartwell, inviting him to the morning room under the pretense of clarifying details about the Egyptian artifacts. "Professor," Poirot began with his characteristic gentle precision, "during the aperitif hour, when Sir Reginald was discussing his opinions on antiquities, did he display any particular behaviors that struck you as significant?" Hartwell shifted uncomfortably, his fingers worrying at his frayed cuffs in a gesture that spoke of deep anxiety. He was rather boastful, actually, quite enjoying himself, holding forth on his superior knowledge and discerning taste. He even made a point of demonstrating his refined palate by tasting the sugar on his cocktail rim before drinking. Rather theatrical, but entirely characteristic of his need to be the center of attention. Poirot noted how quickly the professor had mentioned the sugar rim without direct prompting, a detail that suggested it had remained prominently in his thoughts. "You were positioned to observe this demonstration clearly." "Oh yes, quite clearly. I was standing perhaps 3 feet away, near the fireplace." He held the glass up almost ceremonially before taking that little taste. Hartwell's eyes darted away as he spoke, the telltale sign of a man harboring uncomfortable secrets. Mrs. Vivian Ashford entered next, her emerald velvet dress rustling with the confidence of a woman accustomed to verbal sparring. Yet Poirot's trained eye detected a subtle tension in her shoulders, a barely perceptible tightening around her eyes that suggested carefully controlled anxiety. "Mrs. Ashford," Poirot inquired with deceptive mildness, "your professional relationship with Sir Reginald involved considerable competition, did it not? Was there ever concern that he might resort to unconventional methods to gain advantage in your business dealings?" Her response came with the practiced smoothness of someone who had anticipated such questions. "Sir Reginald was indeed ruthless in business, Monsieur Poirot. He would exploit any weakness, any vulnerability he discovered. He was not above acquiring information through questionable means if it served his purposes. However, I assure you that my own methods remain strictly ethical." Despite her controlled delivery, Poirot observed the slight clenching of her jaw when discussing Sir Reginald's methods, the almost imperceptible pause before her assertion of ethical behavior. These were the small tells that revealed the deeper currents of emotion beneath her polished exterior. Dr. Whitfield, when summoned, provided medical confirmation that supported Poirot's emerging theory. A concentrated solution of cyanide applied to a sugar rim could indeed prove lethal if ingested directly, the physician confirmed with professional gravity. The oral mucous membranes would absorb the poison rapidly, causing almost immediate symptoms. It would be far more effective than sublingual tablets, which typically show signs of tampering through discoloration or altered texture. As the evening progressed, Poirot found himself examining Sir Reginald's personal effects with renewed interest. The silver pillbox showed faint polish marks, tiny circular swirls that suggested recent handling. More significantly, the victim's handkerchief contained 3 sugar grains caught in its weave, 2 of which rolled freely when disturbed, while the third adhered stubbornly to the fabric, before releasing with obvious reluctance. Lady Beatrice, when questioned about the evening's arrangements, revealed an additional detail that added complexity to the emerging picture. Sir Reginald did handle his initial water glass before Jameson replaced it, she confirmed with growing unease. He picked it up, gave it a small sniff of disdain at the lemon garnish, and sent it back quite firmly. He was extraordinarily particular about such details. The methodical accumulation of evidence was painting a picture of calculated murder that exploited intimate knowledge of the victim's habits and vanities. The killer had not simply poisoned medication in a moment of opportunity, but had orchestrated a sophisticated delivery system that relied on Sir Reginald's predictable theatrical gestures. The sugar rim had been prepared with deadly precision, knowing that his characteristic finger-tasting ritual would deliver the poison directly to his system with devastating efficiency. As Poirot reflected on these revelations in the quiet of the drawing room, he understood that the real investigation was only now beginning. The inspector's theory of tampered pills had been precisely what the killer intended them to find, a plausible explanation that would satisfy conventional thinking while concealing the true artistry of the crime. The little grey cells were working furiously now, recognizing that somewhere among Lady Beatrice's carefully chosen guests was a murderer whose psychological insight rivaled his own, someone who had studied human nature with the precision of a scientist and the ruthlessness of a predator. The game of cat and mouse had begun in earnest, and Poirot felt the familiar thrill of matching wits with a truly formidable adversary. The truth lay hidden beneath layers of social propriety and academic respectability, waiting to be uncovered through patient deduction and the careful observation of human behavior under pressure. Each conversation, each subtle probe, was bringing him closer to unmasking a killer whose greatest weapon was not poison, but an intimate understanding of the human heart's deepest vanities and most predictable weaknesses. The following morning brought a development that confirmed Poirot's growing suspicions, while simultaneously raising the stakes of his investigation. He descended to the drawing room at dawn, his methodical mind already planning a careful reconstruction of the previous evening's events, when he encountered Jameson standing motionless beside the silver cocktail tray. The butler's usually impeccable composure had cracked, revealing an underlying distress that spoke of discoveries too disturbing for his orderly world to accommodate. "Monsieur Poirot," Jameson began, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years' professional discretion, "I fear someone has tampered with the evidence during the night. Sir Reginald's cocktail glass has been removed from the pantry, along with 2 others that bore similar residue on their rims." Poirot's grey eyes sharpened with the intensity of a hawk spotting movement in tall grass. The theft of specific glasses, rather than wholesale destruction, suggested a killer who understood exactly which pieces of evidence posed the greatest threat. This was not panic, but calculated damage control, executed with the same precision that had characterized the original murder. "You are certain of this tampering?" Poirot inquired, moving to examine the remaining glasses with delicate precision. "Absolutely certain, sir. I had arranged them precisely as you instructed, noting which positions held glasses with suspicious residue. This morning, 3 specific glasses were gone, while the others remained undisturbed. The selection was too deliberate to be coincidental." Inspector Davies, summoned urgently, arrived with the frustrated expression of a man whose straightforward case was becoming increasingly complex. "Monsieur Poirot, are we to believe our killer is wandering the halls at night, destroying evidence like some Gothic villain?" "On the contrary, Inspector," Poirot replied with that small, satisfied smile that indicated his little grey cells were working at full capacity. "Our murderer has just provided us with the most valuable confirmation possible. By removing only the glasses that could expose their method, they have essentially confessed to the sugar rim technique, while simultaneously revealing their intimate knowledge of our investigation's progress. The psychological implications were profound. The killer had not only been present during the previous day's interviews, but had recognized the specific threat posed by the cocktail glasses. This suggested someone with both the access to move freely through the house and the sophistication to understand investigative methodology. Poirot requested that Miss Pemberton join him in the morning room, understanding that her position as Lady Beatrice's secretary provided her with unique insights into the household's rhythms and secrets. She arrived with the quiet efficiency that had made her indispensable, though her pale features betrayed signs of a sleepless night. "Miss Pemberton," Poirot began gently, "your duties require you to observe the household carefully. Have you noticed any unusual movements during the night hours, any sounds that might indicate someone moving through the corridors?" Her response came with characteristic precision, though her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "I heard footsteps in the corridor around 2 o'clock, Monsieur Poirot. They were soft, deliberate, as if someone were moving with great care to avoid detection. I assumed it was one of the guests using the facilities, but the duration seemed excessive for such a simple purpose." "And the direction of these footsteps?" "They seemed to move toward the service areas, then return after perhaps 10 minutes. I considered investigating, but propriety demanded I remain in my room unless summoned." Poirot nodded thoughtfully, recognizing that the killer's midnight activities had been observed, if not fully understood. The timing suggested careful planning rather than impulsive action, reinforcing his theory that they were dealing with a methodical mind capable of long-term strategic thinking. he decided to test his emerging theory through a subtle psychological probe, understanding that the guilty party would inevitably reveal themselves through their reactions to carefully chosen pressure. Gathering the suspects in the drawing room, he announced his intention to examine the remaining physical evidence more thoroughly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began with characteristic courtesy, "the removal of certain cocktail glasses during the night has provided us with valuable information about our murderer's psychology. They are not merely opportunistic, but demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of investigative methods. More significantly, they remain among us, watching our progress with the calculating attention of a chess master, anticipating their opponent's moves." The reaction was immediate and illuminating. Professor Hartwell's scholarly composure flickered momentarily, his eyes darting toward the empty spaces on the silver tray where the missing glasses had stood. Mrs. Ashford's predatory smile tightened almost imperceptibly, suggesting a mind already calculating new defensive strategies. Gerald Thornfield shifted uncomfortably, though his anxiety seemed rooted more in financial desperation than criminal guilt. Most significantly, Poirot observed how each suspect's gaze lingered on different aspects of the scene. The guilty party, he understood, would focus not on the obvious evidence but on the subtle details that only they knew held significance. The psychological game was intensifying, and soon the killer's careful facade would begin to crack under the mounting pressure of his methodical investigation. The little gray cells were working furiously now, recognizing that the midnight theft had transformed the investigation from a matter of deduction into a direct confrontation between his analytical mind and a criminal intelligence of considerable sophistication. The next phase would require all his psychological insight to force the murderer into a mistake that would finally expose their carefully constructed deception. The theft of the cocktail glasses, rather than hampering Poirot's investigation, had provided him with precisely the psychological leverage he required. A criminal who felt compelled to destroy evidence in the dead of night was a criminal operating under mounting pressure, and pressure, as Poirot well knew, was the great revealer of human nature's hidden truths. He spent the early morning hours in quiet contemplation, understanding that his next moves must be calculated, with chess master precision to force his quarry into the open without allowing them to escape through premature panic. He summoned Jameson to the library, choosing this setting deliberately for its atmosphere of scholarly pursuit and hidden knowledge. The butler entered with his characteristic dignity intact, though Poirot's trained eye detected the subtle signs of a man whose orderly world had been shaken by forces beyond his professional experience. "Jameson," Poirot began with his customary gentleness, "I find myself returning to a detail that may have seemed insignificant at the time. Sir Reginald's water glass, the one he rejected for its lemon garnish. You replaced it personally, did you not?" "Indeed, sir. Sir Reginald was quite particular about such matters. He lifted the glass, gave it a disdainful sniff, and waved it away with considerable irritation. I fetched a fresh glass from the pantry immediately." Poirot's grey eyes sharpened with interest. "And this occurred after he had consumed his cocktail?" "Yes, sir. He had finished his aperitif and was holding forth near the fireplace, quite animated in his discussion of antiquities. It was only when he turned to his water that he made his usual fuss about the lemon." "Most illuminating. And who among the guests was positioned to observe this exchange clearly?" Jameson's weathered features creased in concentration as he mentally reconstructed the scene. "Professor Hartwell was quite close, sir, perhaps 3 feet away. Mrs. Ashford was near the bookcase, but had a clear view. The Thornfields were further back by the piano, and Lady Beatrice was greeting Mr. Blackwood near the doorway." After dismissing the butler, Poirot sat in contemplative silence, his fingertips pressed together in that familiar gesture of intense mental activity. The water-glass incident, seemingly trivial, held profound significance for someone who understood the psychology of guilt. A killer who had delivered poison through the sugar rim would be acutely aware that traces might linger on Sir Reginald's lips. The prompt rejection of the water glass could represent an unconscious act of self-preservation, an instinctive attempt to prevent any secondary contamination that might later be discovered. He decided to test this theory through careful psychological probing, requesting that Professor Hartwell join him in the morning room for what he described as a clarification of certain scholarly details. The professor entered with visible reluctance, his usual academic confidence replaced by barely concealed anxiety that spoke volumes to Poirot's experienced eye. "Professor," Poirot began with deceptive mildness, "I find myself puzzled by certain aspects of Sir Reginald's behavior during the cocktail hour. You mentioned his theatrical display with the sugar rim, but I am curious about his subsequent actions. Did you observe his interaction with the water glass?" Hartwell's response came too quickly, with the rehearsed quality of a man who had anticipated this line of questioning. "Oh yes, quite typical of his fastidious nature. Sir Reginald detested citrus in his water, made quite a performance of sending it back. Jameson handled it with his usual efficiency." "You recall this incident with remarkable clarity, Professor. Was there something particularly noteworthy about Sir Reginald's reaction?" A faint flush crept up Hartwell's neck as he realized his error. His detailed recollection of what should have been a minor incident revealed it had held special significance for him. That is, Sir Reginald's petulance was rather pronounced that evening. He seemed more demanding than usual, more theatrical in his gestures." Poirot nodded thoughtfully, filing away the professor's nervous energy and overly specific memories. "And during this time, while Sir Reginald was occupied with his water glass, where precisely were you positioned?" "Near the mantelpiece, examining the Egyptian artifacts displayed there. I was hoping to discuss certain translation discrepancies with Sir Reginald before dinner, to avoid any public embarrassment regarding my scholarly interpretations." The detective's trained ear caught the slight tremor in Hartwell's voice when he mentioned potential embarrassment, the way his hands clenched involuntarily at the memory of academic humiliation. Here was a man whose professional reputation hung by the thinnest of threads, whose entire identity was bound up in his scholarly standing, and who had been systematically undermined by Sir Reginald's public corrections and pointed references to past failures. As the professor departed, leaving behind the faint scent of nervous perspiration and academic desperation, Poirot reflected on the growing web of evidence that was slowly but inexorably tightening around his primary suspect. The midnight theft of glasses, the overly detailed recollection of seemingly minor incidents, the visible anxiety when discussing professional reputation. These were not the reactions of an innocent man, but of someone whose carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack under the weight of psychological pressure. Yet Poirot understood that suspicion, however well-founded, was not proof. The little grey cells required more than behavioral analysis to construct an unassailable case. He needed to force the killer into a more definitive error, to create circumstances that would compel them to reveal themselves through action rather than mere reaction. The game was entering its most dangerous phase, where a cornered criminal might become desperate enough to strike again. Poirot felt the familiar thrill of intellectual combat, the exhilarating challenge of matching wits with a mind sophisticated enough to have conceived and executed such an elegant murder. The final confrontation was approaching, and when it came, it would require all his psychological insight and deductive brilliance to unmask a killer whose greatest weapon was not poison but an intimate understanding of human vanity and predictable weakness. The stage was set for the climactic revelation that would expose not merely a murderer, but the dark currents of jealousy, desperation, and wounded pride that flowed beneath the surface of civilized society. In the elegant drawing room of Greystone Hall, where Christmas hospitality had been perverted into deadly calculation, the truth was finally ready to emerge from its carefully constructed web of deception. Poirot spent the remainder of that afternoon in quiet contemplation, his methodical mind returning again and again to a detail that had seemed insignificant at the time but now blazed with the clarity of truth finally recognized. The theft of the cocktail glasses had been a desperate gambit, confirming that his investigation was closing inexorably around the guilty party. Yet it was not the stolen evidence that would provide the final key, but rather a moment of human behavior so natural, so instinctive, that everyone present had dismissed it as mere petulance. He summoned Jameson to the dining room, requesting that the butler recreate the precise arrangement of the fatal evening with forensic accuracy. Each place setting was positioned exactly as it had been, each glass and piece of cutlery restored to its original location. The winter afternoon, light slanted through the tall windows at nearly the same angle as it had 2 days earlier, casting familiar shadows across the mahogany table where death had made its unwelcome appearance. "Jameson," Poirot began with characteristic precision, "I require you to describe once more Sir Reginald's interaction with his water-glass. Not merely what he said, but what you observed in his expression, his manner, the subtle details that a trained eye such as yours would naturally notice." The butler's weathered features creased in concentration as he mentally reconstructed the scene. Sir Reginald had been holding forth near the fireplace, quite animated in his discussion of antiquities. When we moved to dinner, he reached for his water-glass almost immediately, as if his mouth had become dry from speaking. But when he lifted it toward his lips, sir, his expression changed quite markedly. Changed in what manner? There was a grimace, Monsieur Poirot, a distinct recoil as if he had tasted something unpleasant. His face had already begun to pale, and he shuddered slightly before pushing the glass away and complaining about the lemon garnish. At the time, I assumed his reaction was simply his characteristic fastidiousness, but now I wonder if there was something more. Poirot nodded with satisfaction, his grey eyes bright with the light of understanding. The water-glass incident had not been mere aristocratic petulance, but Sir Reginald's instinctive attempt to cleanse his palate of the bitter almond taste that was already beginning to register in his consciousness. The poison, delivered through the sugar rim of his cocktail glass, had left its telltale signature on his tongue, and his body's natural response was to seek relief through water. The lemon garnish had provided the perfect excuse, allowing him to reject the glass without admitting to the foul taste that would have revealed his predicament. Most illuminating, Jameson, and during this exchange, who among the guests was positioned to observe Sir Reginald's reaction most clearly? Professor Hartwell was quite close, sir, perhaps 3 feet away by the mantelpiece. He watched the entire interaction with considerable attention, I recall, though at the time I attributed it to scholarly courtesy. After dismissing the butler, Poirot remained in the dining room, his fingertips pressed together in contemplation. The professor's detailed recollection of the water-glass incident, his nervous energy when discussing it, his obvious relief when Inspector Davies had focused on the tampered pills, these were not the reactions of an innocent man, but of someone whose carefully planned murder was being dissected with uncomfortable precision. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Miss Pemberton entered with obvious reluctance, carrying a small envelope that she handled as if it contained something distasteful. "Monsieur Poirot," she began hesitantly, "I discovered this among the papers in Professor Hartwell's room while tidying this morning. I would not normally examine a guest's personal correspondence, but the circumstances seem to warrant an exception to usual propriety." The letter, written on Greystone Hall stationery, was addressed to a colleague at the British Museum. Its contents, though diplomatically phrased, made clear that Professor Hartwell had been quietly investigating discrepancies in the Thornfield collection's provenance documentation. More significantly, the letter referenced his growing suspicions about Sir Reginald's authentication methods and hinted at evidence that could destroy the antiquities expert's reputation permanently. "When was this letter written, Miss Pemberton?" "The date indicates it was composed 3 days ago, sir, but it was never sent. I found it sealed but unposted among his papers." Poirot studied the letter with growing understanding. Here was documentary evidence of Professor Hartwell's motive. Not merely professional rivalry, but a desperate attempt to expose Sir Reginald's fraudulent practices before his own reputation could be further damaged by association. The professor had been gathering evidence, preparing to strike back at the man who had systematically undermined his scholarly standing, when Lady Beatrice's dinner party had provided a more immediate and permanent solution. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Poirot made his final preparations for the confrontation that would expose the truth behind Sir Reginald's elegant murder. The little grey cells had assembled all the pieces of the psychological puzzle: the method, the motive, the opportunity, and most crucially, the behavioral evidence that revealed the killer's identity with mathematical certainty. The sugar rim had been prepared with deadly precision during the brief moment when the cocktail tray was unattended. The killer had exploited Sir Reginald's predictable vanity, knowing that his theatrical finger-tasting ritual would deliver the poison directly to his system. The subsequent theft of evidence, the nervous recollections, the visible relief at misdirection, all pointed to a mind under increasing pressure, a scholar whose desperation had driven him to transform his knowledge of human psychology into an instrument of murder. The stage was set for the final gathering, where Poirot would methodically dismantle the facade of academic respectability to reveal the dark currents of wounded pride and calculated revenge that had motivated this most sophisticated of crimes. In the elegant drawing-room of Greystone Hall, where Christmas hospitality had been perverted into deadly calculation, the truth was finally ready to emerge from its carefully constructed web of deception. That evening, as the December darkness pressed against the tall windows of Greystone Hall like an unwelcome witness, Poirot requested that all the guests assemble in the drawing-room for what he termed a complete examination of the circumstances surrounding Sir Reginald's most unfortunate demise. The phrase carried the weight of inevitability, and each person who entered understood they were gathering not merely for explanations, but for a reckoning that had been building since the moment death had claimed its victim at Lady Beatrice's carefully orchestrated dinner party. Lady Beatrice positioned herself near the windows with rigid composure, her diamonds catching the lamplight like fragments of ice, while Gerald and Penelope Thornfield settled onto the burgundy sofa with the careful distance of a couple united more by financial necessity than genuine affection. Mrs. Ashford chose a chair that provided clear sight lines to all occupants, her emerald eyes alert with the predatory intelligence of someone accustomed to verbal combat. Dr. Whitfield positioned himself near the fire, his medical bag close at hand, while Mr. Blackwood sat with his leather portfolio balanced precisely on his knees, the very picture of legal propriety prepared for uncomfortable revelations. Professor Hartwell entered last, his scholarly composure intact but betrayed by hands that trembled slightly as he took the remaining chair near the bookcase. Poirot observed with satisfaction how the professor's eyes darted toward the silver cocktail tray, still positioned on its table near the mantelpiece, then quickly away as if the sight caused him physical discomfort. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began with characteristic courtesy, his accent lending gravity to each carefully chosen word. "We gather to discuss not merely a murder, but a crime of extraordinary psychological sophistication. The death of Sir Reginald Fortescue was not a crime of passion or crude opportunity, but rather the calculated act of a mind that understood human nature with scientific precision." Inspector Davies, positioned near the doorway with the solid presence of official authority, nodded approvingly. The preliminary investigation had convinced him that the case was essentially solved, the tampered medication providing clear evidence of premeditated murder. The initial theory, Poirot continued, moving with deliberate precision toward the center of the room, suggested that Sir Reginald's nitroglycerin tablets had been coated with cyanide, causing his dramatic collapse when he attempted to take his medication. This explanation satisfied the requirements of logic and evidence, yet it failed to account for certain subtle inconsistencies that troubled my little grey cells considerably. He paused, allowing his grey eyes to sweep across the assembled faces, noting how each person's reaction revealed their inner state. Professor Hartwell's scholarly features betrayed a flicker of anxiety that he quickly suppressed, while Mrs. Ashford leaned forward with sharp attention. Consider, if you please, the timing of events, Poirot continued with methodical precision. Sir Reginald complained of feeling peculiar while seated at the dinner table, before he fumbled for his medication, not after consuming a tablet. Dr. Whitfield, with your medical expertise, you observed moisture on his lips before any sublingual medication could have dissolved, did you not? The physician nodded gravely. Indeed, Monsieur Poirot, the symptoms preceded any attempt to take medication. Precisely. And there is the stubborn fact that requires only common sense to comprehend. Cyanide in sufficient quantity to kill does not wait politely for ceremony. It acts with violent immediacy. Yet Sir Reginald had time to fumble with his pill box, to drop it, to scatter its contents. Something had already delivered the poison to his system before he reached for his pills. Poirot moved to the silver cocktail tray, his movements theatrical, yet purposeful. The real poison, mes amis, was administered here, during the aperitif hour, through a method so elegant in its simplicity that it exploited the victim's own predictable vanity to ensure its success. He lifted one of the remaining cocktail glasses, holding it to catch the lamplight. Sir Reginald had a characteristic habit, observed by everyone present and noted with particular attention by Miss Pemberton. He would trace his finger around the sugared rim of his cocktail glass, taste it with evident pleasure, and make some theatrical jest about it being the only sweetness he could trust in business dealings. This ritual was so predictable, so invariable, that anyone familiar with his behavior could exploit it with mathematical certainty. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft tick of the grandfather clock and a barely audible intake of breath from Professor Hartwell. Dr. Whitfield's medical training allowed him to grasp the implications immediately. "Good God," the physician whispered, "you're suggesting the poison was applied to the sugar rim itself?" "Precisely, Doctor. A concentrated solution of cyanide, carefully applied to one section of the rim, while the cocktail tray was briefly unattended during Jameson's absence to fetch fresh curacao. The killer knew that Sir Reginald would inevitably taste that specific area, delivering the poison directly to his oral mucous membranes with devastating efficiency." Poirot's voice took on the gentle yet relentless tone of absolute certainty. "The evidence supports this theory completely. The sticky residue Jameson noted on the glass rim, the faint, bitter almond scent that lingered even hours later, the sugar grains found in Sir Reginald's handkerchief, two that rolled freely, one that adhered with suspicious tenacity. Most significantly, the midnight theft of specific glasses from the pantry, removed not in panic, but with the surgical precision of someone who understood exactly which pieces of evidence posed the greatest threat. Professor Hartwell's face had gone ashen, beads of perspiration appearing on his forehead despite the room's comfortable temperature. His hands clenched and unclenched in his lap, the unconscious gesture of a man fighting to maintain control as his carefully constructed world began to collapse around him. "But surely," he protested, his voice carrying the strained quality of academic authority under assault, "this is mere speculation. Where is your concrete evidence for such an elaborate theory?" Poirot smiled with quiet satisfaction, recognizing the desperation behind the professor's challenge. "Evidence, mon ami. The evidence lies not merely in physical traces, but in the behavior of human beings under psychological pressure. The evidence lies in who possessed the knowledge to execute such a plan, who had the opportunity during those crucial 2 minutes, and most tellingly, who demonstrated intimate familiarity with investigative methodology by removing only the glasses that could expose their method." He moved closer to Professor Hartwell, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The evidence lies in your own reactions, your own words, your own unconscious revelations of guilt, your detailed recollection of Sir Reginald's water-glass incident. A seemingly trivial moment that held profound significance for someone who knew the victim's mouth had been contaminated with poison. Your visible relief when Inspector Davies announced the pill theory. Your nervous energy when discussing professional reputation and scholarly standing. The professor's scholarly composure was cracking visibly now, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. Around the room, the other guests watched with a fascinated horror of spectators at a public execution, understanding that they were witnessing the methodical destruction of a carefully maintained facade. There is also, Poirot continued with inexorable precision, the matter of the unsent letter found among your personal effects, Professor. A letter that would have begun a public war against Sir Reginald's authentication methods, had you possessed the courage to send it. Instead, you chose a more permanent solution to your professional difficulties. The psychological pressure was mounting to unbearable levels, and Poirot could sense that the final revelation was approaching. The killer's carefully constructed defenses were crumbling under the weight of accumulated evidence and relentless logical analysis. In the elegant drawing room of Greystone Hall, where Christmas hospitality had been perverted into deadly calculation, the truth was finally ready to emerge from its web of academic respectability and wounded pride. The stage was set for the climactic moment when Professor James Hartwell would be forced to confront the undeniable reality of his crime, and Poirot would deliver the final, devastating blow that would expose not merely a murderer, but the dark currents of desperation and calculated revenge that had motivated this most sophisticated of murders. The silence in the drawing room stretched taut as piano wire, each person present understanding that they stood at the precipice of revelation. Poirot's grey eyes, sharp as winter frost, fixed upon Professor Hartwell with the inexorable certainty of a man whose little grey cells had assembled the final pieces of a deadly puzzle. Professor Hartwell, Poirot began with characteristic gentleness that somehow carried more weight than any accusation. The evidence against you is not merely circumstantial, but psychological, behavioral, and ultimately irrefutable. You alone possess the knowledge, opportunity, and desperate motive to commit this most sophisticated of murders. He moved with deliberate precision toward the cocktail tray, his movements theatrical, yet purposeful. The poison was not administered through Sir Reginald's medication, as Inspector Davies initially theorized, but through a method far more elegant and psychologically astute. You exploited the victim's own predictable vanity, knowing that his theatrical ritual with the sugar rim would deliver death with mathematical certainty. Professor Hartwell's scholarly composure began to crack visibly, beads of perspiration appearing on his forehead despite the room's comfortable temperature. You speak of speculation, Monsieur Poirot. Where is your proof? Proof? Poirot smiled with quiet satisfaction. The proof lies in your own behavior, mon ami. Your detailed recollection of Sir Reginald's water-glass incident, a seemingly trivial moment that held profound significance for someone who knew the victim's mouth had been contaminated with poison. Your visible relief when Inspector Davies announced the pill theory. Your midnight theft of specific glasses from the pantry, removed not in panic, but with surgical precision. The detective's voice took on the relentless quality of absolute certainty. But there is more, Professor. This morning I examined the ashes in the morning room fireplace. Among them I discovered fragments of crystal glass, fused with sugar that had hardened like amber. The remains of the cocktail glasses you destroyed to conceal your method. Hartwell recoiled as if struck, his face draining of all color. Around the room the other guests watched with fascinated horror as the methodical destruction of his carefully maintained facade continued. Let me eliminate the other possibilities, Poirot continued with characteristic thoroughness. Mr. Gerald Thornfield possessed motive through his financial difficulties, but he lacks the discipline for such a methodical crime. His troubles are of impulse, not patience. Mrs. Ashford, while possessing both will and opportunity, had no pressing need while her legal disputes remained viable through conventional channels. Dr. Whitfield, despite his medical knowledge, was the first to identify cyanide poisoning, hardly the action of a guilty man seeking to conceal his method. He turned toward Lady Beatrice with a respectful bow. And our hostess, while she might have wished to resolve questions about the sarcophagus's authenticity, would never have perverted the hospitality of her own table in such a theatrical manner. She is, above all things, a guardian of order and propriety. Professor Hartwell's hands began to tremble violently as the walls of his deception crumbled around him. "You understand nothing," he whispered, his voice carrying the bitter undertone of a man whose entire identity had been systematically demolished. Sir Reginald was a fraud, a charlatan who built his reputation on the destruction of better men. The confession, once begun, poured forth like water through a broken dam. He destroyed my career in Cairo with manufactured evidence, purchased testimonials, calculated lies. The papyrus scandal. I was innocent, but he ensured that suspicion fell upon me while he profited from the very forgeries he claimed to expose. For 15 years, I've endured the whispers, the sideways glances, the assumption that I was complicit in crimes I never committed. His voice gained strength as the burden of secrecy lifted. "The Egyptian sarcophagus your husband acquired, Lady Beatrice, I had authenticated it correctly as genuine, but Sir Reginald's greed demanded that it be declared a reproduction to drive down the price for his private acquisition. When I refused to alter my findings, he manufactured evidence of my supposed corruption. My academic career was destroyed overnight." Mrs. Ashford's emerald eyes narrowed with predatory interest. "So you decided to eliminate your tormentor permanently, rather than risk further professional humiliation?" "I decided," Hartwell replied with the calm precision of a scholar delivering a lecture, "to employ the same psychological insight that Sir Reginald used to destroy others. I studied his habits, his vanities, his predictable behaviors with the methodical attention I once devoted to ancient texts. The sugar rim technique was elegant in its simplicity. It exploited his theatrical nature while ensuring the poison would be delivered with absolute certainty." Poirot nodded with the satisfaction of a teacher whose most difficult student had finally grasped a complex theorem. "During Jameson's brief absence to fetch fresh curacao, you applied a concentrated solution of cyanide to one section of Sir Reginald's cocktail glass rim. You knew he would inevitably perform his characteristic finger-tasting ritual, delivering the poison directly to his oral mucous membranes with devastating efficiency. The midnight removal of evidence was calculated rather than panicked," Hartwell continued, his confession now flowing with academic precision. "I realized during your interviews that you had identified the true method. The stolen glasses were a desperate gambit to buy time, though I understood it would only confirm your suspicions. By then, however, I had accepted that exposure was inevitable." Inspector Davies stepped forward with the solid presence of official authority. "Professor James Hartwell, I arrest you for the murder of Sir Reginald Fortescue. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence." Hartwell submitted to the handcuffs with the resigned dignity of a man who had played his final card and lost. As Inspector Davies led him toward the door, he paused to address Poirot with the courtesy of one intellectual acknowledging another's superior skill. "I trust you understand, Monsieur Poirot, that this was never merely about revenge. Sir Reginald's fraudulent practices were corrupting the entire field of antiquities authentication. In eliminating him, I was performing a service to scholarship itself." "Perhaps," Poirot replied gently. "But you chose the methods of a murderer rather than a scholar, Professor. Truth revealed through patient investigation would have served justice better than poison delivered through calculated deception." After the professor's departure, the remaining guests sat in stunned silence, each processing the revelation that their host's carefully orchestrated dinner party had provided the stage for such sophisticated murder. Lady Beatrice moved to the windows, staring out at the December darkness with visible distress. "I feel responsible," she said quietly, her composed features reflecting the weight of unintended consequences. "If I had not insisted on Sir Reginald's authentication of the sarcophagus, if I had not brought them together in such intimate circumstances—" "Madame," Poirot interrupted with characteristic gentleness, "you provided the opportunity, but Professor Hartwell provided the motive, the method, and the murderous intent. The responsibility for this tragedy lies with him alone. Dr. Whitfield closed his medical bag with the finality of a man whose services were no longer required. The irony is profound, Monsieur Poirot. Professor Hartwell possessed the intellectual capability to expose Sir Reginald's fraudulent practices through legitimate channels. Instead, he chose to become the very thing he claimed to oppose, a man who used deception and manipulation to achieve his goals. As the guests dispersed to their rooms, each carrying away their own interpretation of the evening's revelations, Poirot remained in the drawing room, his fingertips pressed together in contemplation. The case had revealed not merely a murder, but the dark currents of academic rivalry, wounded pride, and calculated revenge that could transform a respected scholar into a sophisticated killer. Jameson appeared with characteristic discretion, carrying Poirot's coat and hat with reverent precision. "Will you be departing in the morning, sir?" "Indeed, Jameson. The truth has been revealed. Justice will be served, and the little grey cells may rest until the next puzzle presents itself." He paused, adjusting his magnificent moustaches with satisfaction. "Though I confess, this case has reminded me that the most dangerous criminals are often those who possess both intellectual sophistication and moral corruption. Professor Hartwell's crime was elegant in its conception, but ultimately flawed because he underestimated the power of psychological observation." Lady Beatrice appeared in the doorway as Poirot prepared to retire, her diamonds catching the lamplight like fragments of captured starlight. "Monsieur Poirot, I must thank you for restoring order to my household, though I confess the cost has been higher than I anticipated." "Madame," Poirot replied with a slight bow, "it is often the case that the pursuit of truth reveals more than we wish to know about human nature. Pride, as I have observed, is like the sugared rim of a cocktail glass. Delightful, glittering, and dangerous to those who cannot resist tasting themselves." The following morning, as Poirot departed Greystone Hall under a winter sun that broke through the December clouds, with promise of brighter days ahead, he reflected on the complex interplay of human nature that had transformed a Christmas dinner party into a stage for murder. The case of the dinner guest who never ate would remain in his memory as a perfect example of how the deepest understanding of human psychology could be perverted into an instrument of death, yet ultimately defeated by patient observation and methodical deduction. Behind the elegant Georgian facade of the great house lay the eternal human struggles of pride, ambition, and the dangerous consequences of wounded vanity. In the drawing-room where Sir Reginald Fortescue had died before tasting his carefully prepared meal, justice had finally been served, though the bitter taste of academic betrayal and calculated revenge would linger long after the last guest had departed. As his motor car wound through the frost-covered countryside toward London, Hercule Poirot settled back against the leather seats with quiet satisfaction. The little grey cells had triumphed once again, proving that no crime, however sophisticated, could withstand the methodical application of logic, psychology, and unwavering attention to the small details that revealed the profound truths of human motivation. The affair at Greystone Hall was concluded, but somewhere in the great city ahead, new mysteries awaited the world's greatest detective.